Hello and welcome to lecture number 13. This is topic 2.2, Departure Zones in Africa and the Slave Trade to the United States. The first learning objective is to describe the scale and geographic scope of the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was the process in which enslaved people from Africa were transported by European nations to the Americas. It was so large that by 1800, more people in the Americas were from Africa than any other region in the world. It lasted for 350 years, from 1526 to 1867, and the last major importer was Brazil, which stopped in 1850. In total, more than 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forcibly transferred to the Americas. This does not account for the people who died in transit. It is estimated that more than 1.8 million Africans died during the Middle Passage due to horrific conditions. This also doesn't account for the people who died as they were being marched to coastal cities for export. Out of those 12.5 million, about 5%, approximately 388,000, came directly from Africa to the present-day United States. Of those who came to the United States, they usually landed in Charleston, South Carolina. It was the point of arrival for almost half of all Africans brought directly from Africa to the modern-day United States, totaling just under 200,000 people. Charleston was the center of the United States slave trading, partially because the Carolina colonies were set up by Barbadian white planters who had used slavery in Barbados to grow sugarcane. While they could not grow sugarcane in South Carolina because of the quality of the soil, they found that they could grow rice in the low country. Rice cultivation techniques were brought over by enslaved Africans from the Senegambia region, who were highly skilled in this agricultural practice. African enslaved people were very adept at growing rice, leading to a massive importation of enslaved people to do this agricultural work. Because of the number brought to Charleston, slave auctions like the one seen on the screen were very common in the heart of Charleston. A remnant of the slave trade is the Old Slave Mart Museum, which was a barracoon or a holding cell for enslaved people to be sold or auctioned off. It operated for about 50 years in the early 1800s before it was shut down in the closing years of the Civil War. In Charleston, the auction houses were located on Chalmers Street, which became known as the Wall Street of slavery due to the high volume of transactions. The top enslaving nations were Portugal, Great Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Portugal had the most with 5.8 million, and they dominated the slave trade from the 16th to the 17th century. The Portuguese established the first European trading post in sub-Saharan Africa at Elmina in 1482. The second most was Great Britain with 3.3 million, and they dominated the trade from the 17th to the 18th century. Part of the reason why they took so many African captives to the Americas was because of the crops they were using them to grow, primarily sugarcane. The life expectancy of enslaved people on sugarcane plantations was very low, and it was more financially sound for the planters to continue to capture and import more enslaved laborers than it was to slow down production and keep the enslaved Africans from dying from overexhaustion, heat, or other diseases. The last three enslaving European nations are France, Spain, and Netherlands with 1.4 million, 1.5 million, and 550,000 enslaved people respectively. The French focused their slave trade efforts to the Caribbean with major centers in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, and Martinique. Most of the arrivals to British North America occurred between 1720 to 1780, and this includes parts of the British colonies that are outside of what became the United States, primarily the Caribbean islands of Barbados and Jamaica, where laborers for sugar plantations were in high demand. Though the enslaved populations of the United States reflected the huge numbers of people that were transported, by 1825, 1/4 of the U.S. population was black. The second learning objective is to identify the primary slave trading zones in Africa from which Africans were forcibly taken. The origins of Africans transported directly to North America primarily came from 9 contemporary African regions: Senegambia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, Angola, and Mozambique. The percentages are shown on the map, with the largest regions being Senegambia and Angola. Many of these regions, especially the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra, were known as the Slave Coast due to the high volume of slave exports. It is important to note that Mozambique makes the list because it is located on the eastern side of Africa. Another reason why many of the enslaved people came from these regions is because they were historically slaving centers that exported people when the Portuguese and the Spanish dominated the slave trade and New World exploration. The Portuguese had placed an outpost at Elmina in Ghana and Luanda near Angola, sending many people west. Captives from Senegambia and Angola were nearly half of those brought to North America. Just because the numbers reflect where their point of their departure was, does not mean that this is also the origin of where those enslaved people came from. It's likely that the origin of the enslaved people sent from these locations was likely further inland. The last learning objective is to explain how the distribution of distinct African ethnic groups during the era of slavery shaped the development of African American communities in the United States. This varied based on the different places of origin. Central Africans had experience with Catholicism as discussed in Unit 1 due to the Kingdom of Congo's voluntary conversion to Christianity upon contact with the Portuguese. West Africans had experience with Islam because of the trans-Saharan trade with the Berbers, and some regions had matrilineal traditions. These cultural aspects were brought to the Americas with the enslaved people. When they arrived in what later became the United States, the interactions of different ethnic groups produced combinations of cultural practices. New Creole languages like Gola in South Carolina and new religious practices like Hoodoo, which involved the veneration of ancestors and herbal healing, emerged. The practice of the ring shout was another notable tradition. Because the ancestors of early generations of African Americans came from numerous West and Central African ethnic groups, the modern-day African American population shares some of these ethnic similarities to groups in West Africa, like the Wolof, Akan, Igbo, and Yoruba. The Wolof and Mande people were known for their skills in blacksmithing and agriculture, which they brought to the Americas. Nearly half of those brought to the United States came from societies with Muslim or Christian influence. However, the freedom to practice these religions was curtailed by slave codes. The cultural and ethnic diversity among the enslaved people brought to what later became the United States had a huge impact on the American South. This is reflected in the cultural practices, languages, and beliefs found there. Gullah, as a Creole language, and Louisiana Creole are examples of languages merging African words and grammar with English. Music with complex rhythms, call and response tones, and African-inspired instruments evolved into widely used instruments like the banjo. Religious practices involving conjurers or herbal doctors were more commonly consulted for illnesses than white doctors by enslaved people. African-based culture also influenced the Southern accent, as enslaved people often raised and cared for enslavers' children, leading them to pick up on linguistic habits. Additionally, enslaved people who were also domestic servants and cooks introduced elements of West African cuisine, which became staples of Southern cuisine like fried okra, fried chicken, collard greens, and sweet potatoes or yams. Finally, while many enslaved Africans held on to their traditional beliefs of their Creole religions in the South, more of them were attracted to Christianity after the First Great Awakening in the early 1700s. The First Great Awakening preachers were Protestant and spoke all across the British North American colonies in a way that was very similar in spirit to the traditional belief rituals. They were also attracted to practices like the baptism, which involved full-body immersion into water. The Black Church continued to be an influential institution in the South into the 21st century. In recap, nearly 12.5 million people were transported in the transatlantic slave trade, and only 5% arrived directly in the modern-day United States. Portugal, Great Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands were the top 5 enslaving nations. Enslaved Africans directly transported to North America came from West and Central Africa. The diversity of ethnicities and cultures produced multiple combinations of African-based cultural practices. Finally, the distribution of diverse African ethnic groups in the American South created diverse Black communities. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.